I'm Carmine Gallo, excited to bring you this conversation with Susan Cain, best-selling author and globally recognized TED speaker. Her book, Quiet, spent 7 years. Is that a typo? 7 years on the New York Times bestseller list? Susan, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it wasn't continuous, but it was like on for a lot of that time.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
sure you're winning new fans with Bittersweet, that debuted #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It is a pleasure to be speaking to such a gifted writer and speaker.
Well, thank you so much, Carmine. It is so great to be here with you.
You have a powerful public speaking story that I think people should hear. Susan Cain, when anyone who watches TED Talks hears that name, they know instantly who you are because your TED Talk on the power of introverts has been viewed more than 40 million times. In your early career, you were an attorney, a lawyer. Did your experience in the legal profession give you confidence as a public speaker, or did you have to grow into that role?
I had to grow into that role. And I would say, during all the time that I was a lawyer and in law school, I just gritted my teeth through the times that I had to do public speaking. And, and I chose a legal career as a corporate attorney and not as a litigator, partly because I hated public speaking so much at the time. So no, it was really only when I became a writer and I cared so much about what I was writing. I didn't want my fear of speaking to stand in the way of getting out the message about my books. So that was when I really started figuring out how I was going to overcome this thing.
Take us on that journey. How did you overcome that anxiety that most people feel about public speaking?
The way to overcome any fear, particularly speaking, but really anything, is to expose yourself to the thing you fear in very small doses. So you can't start out by giving TED Talks. You have to start out like exactly the opposite. I recommend people to go to Toastmasters, which is designed to give you a safe and supportive environment where it doesn't matter how much you screw up and you can take as much time as you need. It could take you years. Maybe it will take you years until you feel comfortable, but little by little by little, you're basically retraining your brain to, right now, if you're a nervous speaker, it's your brain thinks that being on a stage is dangerous in the way that a saber-toothed tiger is dangerous. So your brain is telling you, get the hell off the stage. What you want to be doing is having enough successful experiences in these small bite-sized steps that you're retraining your brain that the stage is not dangerous. It's more of a daffodil than a tiger.
Susan, did you take small steps before you took to the TED stage? Because I think most people recognize you from the TED Talk that went viral, but you're saying you took small steps before you had the confidence of taking the TED stage.
Oh, yeah. Very much so. I took a class for people with public speaking anxiety, and I went through that whole class. I went to Toastmasters. I took many steps like that. And even I've given 2 TED Talks. I just gave one now for my book, Bittersweet. But the first TED Talk, the one on introverts that I gave, even that one, like I was flat out terrified when I gave that. I was still able to do it because I had been through all those other steps I just described, but I was terrified. Whereas now when I go to give a talk, I have butterflies in the way that a regular person does, but it's not a big deal anymore.
What advice do you have for entrepreneurs, leaders, aspiring leaders, new graduates, people who have an idea to share and they have a passion to share like you did, but who have anxiety about sharing those ideas publicly?
Well, when we have anxiety like that, the anxiety comes from the fear of being judged, basically, whether we're stepping out on a stage or writing something down or whatever it is, there's the fear of being judged. And what we need to do is shift our mindset to what can I give? Like what information do I have to share, or what like insight can I give that's going to help somebody? And maybe it's only one person in this audience, or maybe it's only one person who's going to read this article I'm writing, but there might be one person whose life is dramatically transformed because of something that I have to say. And once you get into that mindset, you kind of forget all about the fact that you personally are being
Mm.
evaluated. Like that doesn't even really matter. What matters is, oh, I have like this impulse to give something.
Yes,
That's
you're
really the
taking that
emotional peak.
focus. You're taking that focus off yourself, aren't you? And focusing on what people are going to gain from
Exactly.
your idea.
Exactly. Exactly. And I tell people, like, think modestly about it. Like, it's amazing if everybody in the audience gains something. That's the ideal, but maybe just one person does, and their life is different. And then someone else's life is different because of that. That's really that's the gold.
Before we dive into your latest book, Bittersweet, it is beautifully written and quiet. It was a book that was very, very well written. I have to ask you, since you have that very unique experience, you were an attorney and writing, getting obviously used to writing legalese, which is very
Mhm.
different than writing for the masses.
Yeah.
Was that a difficult transition to make? Where did you become? And forgive me if I don't know your earlier biography,
Sure.
before you were an attorney. Where did you learn to become such a beautiful writer, a creative writer as well?
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I had wanted to be a writer since the time I was 4 years old. So for me, the whole legal thing that I did was just this massive detour from what I had wanted to be doing and was meant to be doing in the first place. But I will say, like, I was so trained in legal writing that when I then finally made the switch to creative writing, it I did have to unlearn a lot. I mean,
Did your publisher have to edit your book quite extensively?
well, it was more like I actually did a whole draft, and my publisher said, go back and start from scratch, and we're going to give you all the time that you need to do it with quiet. That happened.
Why?
Um,
But I hadn't heard that story. Why? What happened?
yeah. Well, in that case, it was because it's funny. I love research so much, and I love like nitty gritty of ideas so
Hmm.
much. But I was kind of assuming that other people wouldn't like that to the same extent that I did. So I think they felt that the first draft that I turned in was a little bit too thin, that it didn't
Could
have enough
be. Could be
research in it.
interesting.
And so they were
Yeah.
like, go back and make this much meatier. And I
I
was like, oh, meaty? You want it to be meaty? Excellent. But
Exactly.
yeah,
I feel the same way because I've written 10 books now, mostly on leadership and communication. And I love the research side. I love the
yeah,
science and the psychology of it. And it's a delicate balance. You don't want to put people to sleep with the research, but
right.
you also need to add the research because it adds a totally different dimension to it. So it is a sensitive balance to strike.
It's a very delicate balance. And then if you're trained as a lawyer, or probably to some extent in business too,
Right.
you're not like really trained in the art of storytelling. Like as a lawyer, you're actually trained to do the opposite. You're trained to take a really complicated story that's happened to people and extract from it the principles, and like leave the
Right.
story as the husk that's left behind, and the principles are the thing. But when you're constructing a book, you're doing the exact opposite. You need the story in order to convey the principles. So it's
Yep.
very different.
In your new book, Bittersweet, you teach us how to turn sorrow and sadness into emotions that make us feel more alive, I guess,
Mhm.
in many ways.
Yeah.
I love this quote: bittersweetness is the hidden source of our moonshots, masterpieces, and love stories. How is this feeling of melancholy or longing or pain, sadness, sorrow the source of masterpieces?
Because what we don't understand in the business world and in secular culture in general is that, um, I could say mainstream culture in general, that the DNA of all humans is a kind of existential longing for like a more perfect and beautiful world, like for goodness, for truth, for beauty, for love. Um, we see this really clearly when we look in the religious dimension, because
Mm-hmm.
there you see the longing for the Garden of Eden, and the longing for Zion, and the longing for Mecca, and the longing for the beloved of the soul. It's like very clear in that dimension. But then you move into everyday culture, And no one talks about that.
Hmm.
Though we have ways where we do, like in The Wizard of Oz, there's Dorothy. She's
Yeah.
longing for somewhere over the rainbow. It's the exact same thing. Harry Potter, he enters the story longing for the parents who he'll never be able to remember. He's been orphaned. So that longing, that's the heart of the creative impulse.
Hmm.
It's the word longing means to grow longer, like to reach for.
Mm-hmm.
There's if when you're wanting to build a rocket to Mars, or a more beautiful bridge, or whatever you're doing, you're wanting to make manifest an aspect of that more perfect and beautiful world. So we need to find a way of like translating these deep
Yeah.
spiritual impulses that all humans have, whether we're atheists or believers, makes no difference. Translate those impulses into the everyday so we can understand them.
Well, then it took a lot of courage to write the book, and you really had to think through it because, like you said, it is these are difficult, deep emotions to translate.
Yeah.
And that's why we need someone like you to do that translation. Susan, you ask a series of questions in your book that are intended to measure how deeply we experience these emotions like melancholy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to take you through a few of these questions because I took the quiz myself. Number one, do you tear up easily at touching TV commercials? Yes, all it takes is an Apple commercial.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
all it takes for me.
Yeah, they're
So,
very good at
yes.
it.
Are you especially moved by old photographs? Yes. Do you react intensely to music, art, or nature? Yes. I love this question. Are you moved to goosebumps several times a day? Interesting you asked that just before I came into the office today when I was at home. As I was getting ready to leave and have this conversation, I had recorded something on TV from the night before. It was on in the background as I was getting ready, and something struck me. I got goosebumps. I get goosebumps all day long. It could be over anything. This conversation will give me goosebumps. So I took your bittersweet quiz, which is in the book. I'm off the chart. I scored a 9.6. And you
Wow.
say,
Okay.
and you say if you score above 5.7, you are a true connoisseur of the place where light and dark meet. Thank you. I think it's going to be the connoisseur. I'm not sure. What am I to take from that information? What am I supposed to do with it?
Yeah. Well, so I constructed this quiz with the psychologists David Yaden from Johns Hopkins and Scott Barry Kaufman. And they ran a whole bunch of tests from it. And this is all very preliminary, but what we found is that people who score high on the bittersweet quiz, like you, are prone to states that predispose us to creativity and also to awe and wonder and spirituality.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah, pegged me. Yes, exactly. Maybe that's why I've written 10 books and I have so many more ideas. And okay, good.
Yeah. But it's not
This
to
is a
say
good therapy session. I like it.
There's also a correlation. I don't know if this is you or not, but there's a strong correlation with a trait that the psychologist Elaine Aron calls high sensitivity, and that's basically people who just react that much more intensely to everything that life throws at you. The beauty of the sunsets and the screeching sound of the construction site out your window. A sensitive person feels it all that much more intensely. So there's a real correlation there too. Between that and bittersweetness.
Well, so if I answer these questions in the affirmative and there's a high correlation between high scores and bittersweetness and melancholy, what am I to do with that knowledge?
Well, I think of bittersweetness as a kind of hidden superpower. And what we know from all our myths and religions and Marvel movies and all of it is that there are a lot of different types of superpowers available to us, right?
Yeah.
There's lightsabers, there's like the ability to
there's introversion.
There's introversion.
Someone may have written about that.
Yes, exactly. And so this is another kind of superpower. So like I've talked with friends of mine who have scored 0 on the bittersweet quiz, and they are incredibly powerful in other ways.
Hmm.
But this is one source of great power in this world that our culture does not pay enough attention to, because it's become a cliche in the last year or two that we live in a culture of toxic positivity. You're supposed to be so relentlessly cheerful and upbeat. You're not supposed to be tuned into this frequency of
Hmm.
life. And yet, if you are one of these people who's tuned into this frequency, there are enormous powers associated with it as a leader, as a creative person, as a human.
I think bittersweet applies to leaders. And I'll tell you my interpretation, and you tell me if this is a good summary of it. But I think that leaders who can tap into these emotions of sorrow, sadness, I believe that they can be more empathetic to the suffering of others, but also they are more authentic leaders, at least in my experience, because they can talk openly about their feelings of longing or sadness or sorrow around either events that are happening or their own personal experiences. And they turn that struggle or sadness into something empowering. But I think they are more authentic leaders. And that's where I think it applies.
I agree with that. And I think what you're getting at, there's a line of research that looks at different types of power that leaders hold, or can hold. And there's one style of leadership that's known as positional leadership, that has more to do with power, and it's also more associated with displays of anger as its primary emotion. So a positional leader, people are very aware of that person's power to hire them or fire them and to make those kinds of decisions that will impact their lives. But then there's a different style of leadership that's known as relational leadership. And that's more about, when you have a relational leader, it's more like what you just described, and people who work for them will say that they feel like they're on that leader's side. They're like all on the same side together, that they're rooting for them, that they're not far from wanting to sabotage them. They're wanting to root for them. And that style of leader is more associated with being able to make expressions of sorrow.
Oh, I love that. I haven't used those words exactly, but I certainly have identified that there is a difference between a leader by title, because people have to follow you because, well, you're the boss. They have to follow you or they'll get fired, and leaders who are inspiring. I've chosen to spend my time writing and focusing on people, on leaders who are truly inspiring. And they're very different, very different mindset and a different way of connecting with people than just somebody who's a leader by title alone. But I like your phrase, relationship, a relational leader.
Yeah. And I just want to make sure to say that it's not my phrase. This comes from the work of management researchers. So there's studies by Juan Madera, Brent Smith, and Tanya Schwartzmuller. All of them have done studies in this area. And I just want to make sure to credit them for that. And I write
Giving
about
credit where it's due.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's great. I think you can transform. I love leaders who transform either their pain or longing into inspiration. And I think that's rare, though. When you agree, it's kind of a rare trait to have as a leader. It's not every leader who we want to join them on their journey and to be aligned with them.
Yeah.
But boy, it's special when we meet them.
Yeah. And the kinds of emotions that we use, I mean, different ones are appropriate to different kinds of situations. So like Tanya Schwartzmuller gives the example of, like, if you are leading a company at a time when there's some kind of outside threat to the company, that's a situation where expressions of anger might be most appropriate and most helpful for the people who you're leading, to know that they've got like a fierce leader who's going to represent them against this threat. But let's say something's happened in the life of the company, or she gives the example of a product that's harmed people and it needs to be recalled. That's a time when a leader who's able to express sorrow and empathy, that's really appropriate, and that's what's most needed. So, these things aren't either or. In a perfect world, we can choose from different ways of being, but we're all oriented in one direction or another.
Well, Susan, thank you for giving me and millions of readers a different, empowering way of looking at ourselves and our lives. So thank you
Absolutely.
so much, Susan. It's a pleasure meeting you, and what a wonderful book. And
So
it's going to
nice to
look
meet
great on my bookshelf. It's a beautiful cover.
you. Thank
As
you
a
so
fellow
much.
author, I recognize these things. Very much.
Yeah, I love it that you do. The designer Jackie Phillips and I spent so much time trying to get that cover right. So I love it that you appreciate it, and
And
thank
you
you
know the
so much for
designer's
having me.
name. You know
Oh
the
my gosh,
design.
I love her. Love her. Yes.
Terrific. You're a joy. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Carmine. Take care.